June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Theater. As the sun rose, little did the world know that one of the most decisive battles of World War II would be taking place off the Midway Atoll.
Roughly 2 years after World War II kicked off in Europe, the Japanese Empire attacked the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor in the early hours of December 7th, 1942 with a devastating, precise blow. Zero planes, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and high-altitude bombers were used in the attack on Pearl Harbor. The purpose of the attack was to force the U.S. to spend time rebuilding ships and aircraft instead of preventing the Japanese from taking more islands in the Pacific Ocean. The attack in Pearl Harbor led the U.S. declaring war on the Empire and the Axis powers shortly after. The Japanese Navy attacked the Midway Atoll because it was a strategic outpost for the U.S. Navy. Taking this point would allow the Empire to launch devastating attacks on the U.S. and other islands in the Pacific, and an ambush was deemed the most effective way for the Empire to take the Midway Islands. In order to pull off this dramatic attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sent a small naval force to attack the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. This was an effort to draw away some of the ships from Midway for a swifter and easier attack on the U.S. base. The Japanese Navy used a secure code named JN-25 to transmit information about the Battle of Midway. A team of U.S. codebreakers broke the code. However, they were unsure of a subject that was called an ambush attack on AF. The codebreakers suspected it was Midway, but had no way to confirm. To make sure that the Japanese were planning an attack on Midway, the Americans sent out a false message stating that Midway was running low on water. Surely enough, the Americans intercepted Japanese code and it read that AF was almost out of water. This allowed the Americans to be prepared and perform a counter-ambush. They also knew that the Japanese launched a fake attack on the Aleutian Islands.
The Battle of Midway officially began at 9:04 a.m. on June 3rd of 1941, when an American reconnaissance plane spotted key signs of Japanese invasion 500 miles west of Midway. The reconnaissance plane was fired at by Japanese deck gunners shortly after. At 9:25 a.m., an American pilot had reported that he had found the main body of the Japanese force 700 miles west of Midway. In reality, he saw only a small section of the invading force. At 12:30 p.m., the U.S. dispatched Boeing B-17s from Midway. 9:15 p.m. rolled around and a quartet of consolidated PBY Catalinas were launched from Midway. The fighting of June 4th began early, starting at 1:15 a.m. before the sun had even showed itself to the ocean. The recently launched consolidated PBY Catalinas intercepted the Japanese and proceeded to send out several torpedoes before strafing and retreating. The torpedoes hit the Japanese fuel tanker Akembo Maru. This would prove to be the only time during the battle that an American torpedo attack was successful. At 5:45 a.m., a Catalina pilot decoded a Japanese message and radioed it to the American fleet. The message read, quote, "Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150, end quote. By 6 a.m., every aircraft on or around Midway was airborne. 6:15 rolled around and about 24 Marine fighters, a mixture of American Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and Grumman F-4F Wildcats, spotted and engaged with the first wave of Japanese. At 6:30, airable bombardment began on Midway. The battle was a downhill battle for America, as American forces were outnumbered by 4 Japanese combatants per each American. The Japanese Zero planes were more capable in nearly every way to the American fighters during this time in the war. Around 7 a.m., a quartet of Marine B-26 Marauders began a torpedo attack on the Akagi, a Japanese carrier flagship, with 6 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers following close behind. Nearly all of the fighters were shot down by the Akagi's air defense, and none landed a hit on the Akagi. With the belief that there were no American ships in proximity, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered for the Kaga and Akagi to have their torpedoes replaced with bombs, a process that would take around 2 hours for completion. At 7:28, Japanese scouts reported the sighting of 10 American ships approaching the Japanese fleet. The Japanese prepared for combat at 7:45 a.m. 10 minutes later, a squadron of 16 U.S. Marine Corps Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked the Soryu. They landed 0 hits and anti-aircraft fire, and Japanese fighters halved their numbers. At 8:10, American B-17s carried out a high-level bombing assault, which led to minimal damages on both sides. At 8:20, a squadron of 11 U.S. Marine Corps Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers targeted the Haruna. Most of the bombing runs they tried to carry out were blocked by Japanese fighters, and the one that did work did not hit the Haruna. During the battle, the American carriers were divided into 2 groups, Task Force 16 and Task Force 17. The 2 task forces joined each other at 6 a.m., and at 7 a.m. planes from Task Force 16 were deployed. At 8:38, Task Force 17 followed suit and began deploying planes. 9:20, 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedoes bombers finally struck the Japanese. Soon after, Torpedo Squadron 8 led an assault on the Soryu that led to all but one American combatant perishing. Of the 41 Devastators that fought at Midway, only 6 returned to their carriers. Wade McCluskey, commander of the Enterprise's aerial force, arrived at what was supposed to be an interception site before Admiral Nagumo changed the Japanese route. McCluskey decided to continue northwest instead of going back to the Enterprise. This decision would be regarded by Admiral Nimitz as, quote, one of the most important decisions of the battle, end quote. This is because McCluskey, and with a squadron of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, eventually spotted a lagging destroyer. At 10 a.m., McCluskey spotted the Kaga and Akagi, and at 10:22, McCluskey's forces attacked, scoring multiple devastating bomb hits on both ships. Simultaneously, 17 Dauntlesses that had accompanied the Yorktown's fighters charged at the Soryu. Within minutes, all 3 of the carriers were in flames. While the Enterprise lost over a dozen Dauntlesses, the Japanese were devastated. Nagumo hits on both ships. Simultaneously, 17 Dauntlesses that had accompanied the Yorktown's fighters charged at the Soryu. Within minutes, all 3 of the carriers were in flames. While the Enterprise lost over a dozen Dauntlesses, the Japanese were devastated. Nagumo abandoned the Flaming Akagi and transferred his flight to the Nagara. At 10:50, Tamo and Yamaguchi assembled an attack force into the air. Noon rolled around, and Yamaguchi's forces severely damaged the Yorktown. At 2:55, after being hit once again, the Yorktown was momentarily abandoned. At 3:30, Dauntlesses from the Enterprise in Yorktown, as well as dive bombers from the Hornet, took to the skies in an assault on the newly located Hiryu. At 4, Admiral Fletcher, the man in charge of Task Force 17, relinquished control of the fleet to Admiral Spurns of Task Force 16. At 5 p.m., the first round of American bombers descended upon the Hiryu. Within the span of a few minutes, the Hiryu was devastated, being hit with at least 4 bombs. Half an hour later, the Dauntless dive bombers arrived and began an assault on ships in the vicinity. Admiral Spurns, after gathering American forces, moved the force east, away from the battle, instead of to pursue the enemy west. This was the last decision made of the battle.
On June 5th, the Yorktown was taken to be salvaged and repaired. The Akagi and Hiryu, both too damaged to be used, were scuttled. Admiral Yamaguchi, as well as the captain of the Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tomio Kaku, both decided to go down with the Hiryu. Spurns launched 60 bombers on the evening of the 5th, hoping to find retreating Japanese forces. The U.S. forces were able to find the Tanakaze alone. Despite being under significant pressure, the Tanakaze was able to escape and make its way back to the Japanese force. June 6th came, and Spurns decided to continue the pursuit of the Japanese fleet. Spurns' fleet was able to find straggling Japanese ships with no protection from the U.S. forces. The Mikuma was sunk, and the Mogami, Ashio, and Arashio were severely damaged. During the morning of the 6th, the Yorktown's repair operation began. The Haman, as well as multiple other ships, formed a protective ring around the damaged Yorktown. At 1:35 p.m., the Japanese submarine, the I-168, snuck up on the repair site and sent waves of torpedoes in the direction of the Haman and Yorktown. The torpedoes hit both ships and did massive damage. The Haman was ordered to be abandoned and sunk within minutes. The I-168 was able to escape back to the Japanese fleet. Repair crews believed that the Yorktown was still fixable, but by the early morning of the 7th, it was clear that the Yorktown was too damaged to be repaired. At 5 a.m. on the 7th of June, the Yorktown slipped under the waves of the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was a major turning point in the Pacific theater as it shifted the initiative from the Japanese to the Americans, allowing the U.S. to launch the attack on Guadalcanal. It also put the Americans back on their feet and restored their morale, as they launched more and more attacks. The Imperial Japanese Navy would not be capable of overcoming the loss of 4 carriers and over 100 trained pilots, and with the loss at Midway, the Japanese offensive in the public was overturned, and the United States began offensive action in the Pacific. After the final moments of Midway concluded, the damage to both sides was revealed, and both suffered fatal losses. During that time, the Japanese forces were greater in numbers, but so were their losses at Midway. The Japanese had lost approximately 3,057 men across 4 carriers, 1 cruiser, and around 320 aircraft. However, despite their smaller numbers, the United States had only suffered minor losses, losing approximately 362 men throughout 1 carrier, a single destroyer, and 144 aircraft. In conclusion, throughout the hundreds of battles fought during World War II, one of them stood out the most, representing an impressive feat by the U.S. code-breaking team. Before World War II, the Japanese Navy controlled most of the islands in the Pacific Ocean. The Battle of Midway in 1942 turned the tide of war, as afterward, Japan did not have enough military power to defend against the United States. This allowed the U.S. to launch many attacks, such as their attack on Guadalcanal, making the Battle of Midway one of the most impactful battles during World War II, and a turning point in the Pacific theater.